we have a very interesting topic, which is something that is creating social political churn in many parts of the world, and it's important dissent, whether immigration and how it affects national cohesion or national integration. How well are immigrants assimilated or integrated into mainstream society? We are watching, this has come obviously in the wake of the US elections, where immigration formed such a large part of the political discourse in the US elections. And not only illegal immigration, I may add, parts of areas of the legal immigrant universe has also been impacted. I would imagine the discourse is true in a different way in Europe as well. We have seen different countries in Europe reacting to waves of immigration. Some have been welcoming, some have not. In some countries, it has actually had a political impact. In others, not yet. But the economic strain, the political strain, and the social strain that newcomers, particularly in the last 10 years, and we've seen waves of migration from, whether it is from Afghanistan, Syria, from Africa into Europe, has challenged or has impacted social cohesion. So this panel will discuss the complexities of immigration, national identity, and the need for policies that foster integration in societies. So the questions, there are three main questions that I think our panelists will address today. One, how can states with liberal founding principles balance respect, tolerance, and national solidarity? Is there an emerging consensus about how immigrants should be treated? Are nations that host expansive diasporas prepared to deal with the impact that extremism and political divisions may have on their own domestic politics? And certainly here, India comes to mind. Are there regions or countries that have successfully integrated immigrants while maintaining social cohesion? And I have a very distinguished panel that will answer all of these questions. May I begin with Caroline Sophie Sichon from the Junge Union in Germany.
Good evening, everybody. I'm so delighted to be here tonight and to talk on this topic. And of course, especially Germany is a country that had a lot of debates currently about migration. It was a big topic in our last election that we just had, as many of you probably heard. And of course, Germany is a multicultural country nowadays, and I think that's something that some people have accepted and are also welcoming, and others have not. But we've seen since 2015, we're also, the party I belong to, the Young Union, is the youth organization of the CDU, has opened borders for basically everyone. And that is something that has been an ongoing process until now, and we can see in our country that people are tired of it, that people cannot take that anymore because the maximum of what the society is able to help with, to integrate, has reached its limit. And so that is leading to a lot of inner political problems and issues, and that also leads to a lack of security nowadays as well. And especially in our campaign, it also led to debates because we had multiple terror attacks, and we have to face through those attacks and through other circumstances that there's a large part of the population who just do not want this mass migration anymore. And if politics don't find a way to tackle this and to finally solve this problem, people will vote ultra right-wing parties, which are also against our democracy, which are against the European Union, and which do not stand for the free country that we live in. And so we have to find in the center of the Democratic Party solutions, and that very, very soon.
Right. Uh, Actually, it's interesting that you spoke about the strains in Germany. On a personal level, I was there in 2017, and we were, as a journalist, covering Prime Minister Modi's visit, and we were given a very interesting tour of the immigrant facilities, of how they were welcomed, and in typical German efficiency. That was an hour-long briefing. Our next briefing was with the counterterrorism police in Berlin, who listed all the crimes that they attributed to immigrants, which was sort of indicative of the strains that were in place. Nathan Sales, from non-resident senior fellow of the Atlantic Council, former U.S. acting under Secretary of States. Nathan, and you, of course, in the U.S., immigration is such a part of the recent elections, and we've seen plane loads of illegal immigrants being shipped out in U.S. military aircraft, certainly to India, even other parts of the world. Over to you.
Well, thanks very much, everyone, for being here, burning the midnight oil with us on the panel, and thanks for an important question on an important topic. I guess I would start by gently resisting the framing of this panel, importing dissent. There's nothing wrong with dissent. We should welcome dissent. Dissent is good to the extent that it helps us refine our arguments, and through a process of give and take, come closer to democratic consensus. What I think many voters in the United States are concerned about is not dissent as such, but the extent to which new arrivals share certain fundamental structural values about what it means to be an American. I would love to import some dissenters. Let's get more Africans who disagree with progressive nostrums about gender ideology, right? That's great. That's good for America. It's good for the Republican Party. So it's not about dissent, but what I think it is about is in a creedal nation like the United States. Well, actually, let me take a step back. America is incredibly heterogeneous, geographically, religiously, ethnically, from country of origin. We are so diverse. And because we are diverse, it's important for us to have a shared sense of values, underlying values to which we are all committed, the American creed. And there's a number of different high level of generality principles that form the American creed, and the importance of equality of opportunity, equality before the law, free speech, entrepreneurialism, hard work. There's one in particular that I think bears emphasis today in this conversation and in this historical moment, and that's the importance of freedom of religion. The importance of pluralism and tolerance and respect for difference. This, unfortunately, is a value that has come under increasing strain in the United States, particularly at elite universities. Our best and brightest are now awash in places like Columbia University or UCLA or Harvard, are now awash in a sea of religious intolerance. And it's that tension between new arrivals in the United States, whether on a student visa or a work visa or some other immigration instrument, the tension between new arrivals who sometimes do not share these fundamental principles. And again, these are not partisan, these are not ideological. It's not you have to be a Republican to come to America, you can't be a Democrat to come to America. It's, do you believe in what the First Amendment says? And if you do, great, we'll roll out the red carpet for you. If not, maybe you'd be more comfortable in a less religiously heterogeneous society where you're not required to accommodate people who have a different faith system than you do. I'll stop there, but we can get into more as we go on.
Thank you, Nathan. Stefan, may I now turn to you? Because you obviously from the SWP, you probably have a slightly different view.
I don't know. I think it's important to differentiate what we mean by talking about migration. We have had in Germany migration since the early 60s when the so-called guest workers came to Germany, and now 30% of Germans have a migration background. And I would claim we have some problems there, but it was more or less a successful migration, and they are to a great degree integrated. I think what we talk about is the waves of migration we had from people who were seeking refuge, who asked for asylum, or tried to flee the desperate economic situation in the countries they came from. And we had three waves. The first one in the 90s, caused by the Balkan Wars. The second one by this war in Syria and Afghanistan, and the last one in 22 by the war in Ukraine. And I think these people seeking refuge or trying to escape the situation in their home countries, they're not allowed to take on work. They depended on social transfers. We have a relatively high degree of crime in this section of the population, and in addition, we had this terrorist assaults, and all this I think created a perception of migration very much determined by this group, even a small part of this group, but. Caroline is right. We ended up with a party right now which has 20% of votes in the parliament. They even doubled the share of votes compared to the last elections. When you include the left-wing populist party, which didn't make it to parliament but has another 5%, is also anti-migrants. So 1/4 of Germans voted for anti-migrant parties, and this is clearly that. Shows that we have an issue to deal with. When you look at the preliminary results of the coalition negotiations, 60 lines of 400 refer to migration. Only 6 to 4 on security policy, by the way. So there is a strong focus on that, and there's certain determination also of the government to deal with that. At the same time, we have the efforts on the European level, the so-called Pact on Migration and Asylum, which also tries to contribute to solve these problems, not only Germany, which is affected. And I think we have also to make some progress on the European level, but I can come back to this later again. Thank you.
Thank you. Sushant, from a very different part of the world, in a part of the world we don't often talk about, but India's gone through waves of migration and certainly waves of immigration after independence. What has been the Indian record, and how has India dealt with the kind of immigration that we see in Europe, but what we have seen here since 1947?
I'll speak about India, but then I'll just say a word or two about what's happening in Europe. I think the Indian record has been pretty good. People who migrated after partition between India and Pakistan, at least in India, people who came from West Punjab, or what is Pakistan now, what is now Bangladesh, and Bangladesh happened even in 1971, got assimilated very easily within the local communities. But I think it's important to recognize that it is not only the generosity of the local communities in which migrants come and settle, but I think it's equally incumbent upon the migrants how well they assimilate in the communities in which they are settling. And to that extent, I think the Indian experience has been quite satisfying, I would say, because we've seen people maintaining their identity and yet assimilating in, and frankly, India is, if you think America is heterogeneous and diverse, America is like a kindergarten compared to India's heterogeneity and diversity, where every 20 kilometers language changes, dialects change, um, everything changes, right? So in a country as diverse as India, for people to come and get assimilated, uh, and nobody treats them as they came as though they came from outside a particular community. So I think that's been a success story. Similarly, uh, to a great extent, until recent events, most of the Indian diaspora in other parts of the world has gone and settled out there. They might maintain their own identity, they might maintain their own culture, but they also try and fit into the societies in which they go. By and large, law abiding, they work hard, they try and be successful in whichever community they go. Uh, Now, the thing with when I look at Europe, for example, I sometimes wonder what you guys were thinking when you just opened the doors. Okay, maybe you were being very generous to refugees, uh, but I'm surprised that the reaction which has now started coming in many European countries has come as late as it has come. I would have imagined it would have come much earlier. And I still don't think that European countries have actually woken up to the fact that their models of multiculturalism have uh, have failed. I'm not going to use soft language out here. Um, I think it's failed. And it's failed because the host communities, I don't know what they were thinking, but ideally, if somebody has come into a particular country, then I think it is incumbent on the migrant communities to fit into that society. You can't say that I'm going to bring in the standards of Somalia and expect those are going to be implemented in Germany or France or Sweden. It doesn't work that way. You can't want to create a Pakistan in the United States and expect that everything will be hunky-dory and people will accept it. Unfortunately, in Europe, we've actually seen a kind of a tolerance. Even if somebody wants to impose Sharia law, even in local communities, your governments look the other way. How does that work? Why would you even allow something like that to happen? And one final, I'll just take half a minute more. I think another successful model which we have seen is not exactly very assimilative, but which is countries like the UAE. People have gone out there. The UAE enforces its laws very strongly, but it's very fair to the migrants who live out there. They are not given citizenship for the most part, but their property is safe, their lives are safe, they are able to get proper education, they are able to progress, and then they can come back to whichever country they've gone from. So I would imagine that there is a certain model which is also there in the Middle East, which can be replicated. But the one model which simply does not work is the European model.
Defend the European model. As the Natalie Totti from who's director of the IAI in Italy. How is the Italian experience? Has that been very different from the soul searching that we see in Germany, Austria, Sweden, Belgium? Has that been different, or does Italy have a different story?
So I'm not sure. I mean, I think what I'm going to do is actually perhaps give a slightly different take to the question more broadly. And what I wanted to do is really point to what, in many respects, is a paradox. Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, looking across Europe, Italy included, but across Europe, what you see is that those countries that have a higher share of migration are also those countries that, taken over time, have done better economically, right? So obviously there is the long-standing German problem. I'm going to come to Germany also at the current juncture, but broad, sort of looking at it with, taking the long view. If you think about Germany, if you think about Sweden, if you think about Norway, these are the countries that do better, and there is a very tight correlation between the share of migration and economic performance. But then you also look at another apparently contradictory phenomenon, and that is in moments of economic crisis, this political salience of migration goes up, right? And so, indeed, you see that whereas, for instance, in times when the economy in Germany was going well, or in Turkey it was going well, actually migration was not much of an issue. It is only when the economy goes badly, right, that migration all of a sudden becomes a politically salient question. And a similar case can be made actually of the US itself, right? I mean, the political salience of migration in this last election was really the flip side of the coin of the whole debate over the cost of living crisis.
Right.
If people felt that things were going very well, possibly, not necessarily, the political salience of the migration question would not have been so high. And I think a sort of added corollary to the paradox is that those countries where migration is most felt as a political issue are countries that actually don't have any migrants, right? Take the case of Hungary, for example. I mean, migration is up there in terms of, the most. We heard it this morning from the Hungarian foreign minister. We're about no migration. How many migrants does Hungary have? Well, pretty much none. Right? So there's obviously something to be figured out here, and I haven't quite got my own head around it, because there's obviously a story of reality, there is a story of political imagination, and there is a story about emotions. And I don't think we talk about emotions enough when we talk about this and many other subjects as far as politics is concerned. Because I think there is something to be said about the sequence that essentially takes us from a story of decline, whether real or perceived, and it can be an economic decline, it can be a demographic decline, the way in which that actually instills fear. Fear leads to closure, closure leads to decline, right? And the question is, how do you actually get out of that vicious cycle? And what are the recipes? And I don't have the recipe, but I think that we can think about three sets of things. I mean, so obviously if there's a story about decline and part of the decline is economic, then the question is what economic recipes are going to do the trick? Okay, I don't have the answer, but there's something to be said there. I think a second set of answers, which then actually takes us to Italy, and there's another paradox, actually has to do with legal migration. And so if part of that economic answer actually passes through legal migration to the extent to which there is demographic decline, and under demographic decline you end up not growing almost by definition, you end up having the paradox of a country like my own with a far-right government that talks a lot about migration, has opened up a center in Albania to process asylum applications with a total number of 0 asylum applications being processed there, and they never will be processed there. In the meantime, actually legal migration has been going up very significantly. Why? Because companies are asking for it, right? So, that there is something there to be figured out on that legal migration and how do you go about it politically, basically. And then something inevitably also to be tackled with the entire information space. I mean, especially in those countries where migration is highly politicized and securitized, if you go through public opinion polls, they regularly, if you ask them, what do you think the share of migration is in your country? In countries where it's very little, but it's highly politicized, it shoots up. And you see the variation of it depending on when and how there is a politicization of migration. So obviously there is, I think, both an economic answer, a legal migration answer, and a sort of information slash kind of democracy, right? And disinformation, if you like, part of the answer. How to go about it, I don't know. What the mix is, I don't know. But I think if you, again, look at this very mixed experience across Europe, you actually realize that unless we get our heads around some of these contradictions and address these different, in a sense, sort of tracks, we're probably not going to get around dealing with the problem.
Thank you. Actually, that's it's interesting because it brings to mind 2 points, and one is a bit of an uncomfortable question, which I will ask to all the European panelists here, which is Europe has had waves of migration and illegal migration, mainly asylum seekers. You've had them from Afghanistan, you've had them from Syria, and now you have them from Ukraine. Is there essentially a difference between how a Ukrainian migrant is assimilated or treated in a European country as opposed to a Syrian? Is there a difference? A second point, and this is just to respond to Natalie. There is Japan, which has both demographic pressures and economic pressures as a result of demographic pressures, and yet Japan has not opened itself to any migration, and in fact, just as an Indian, they take some Indians, and they're very clear what kind of Indians they want. To put it very bluntly, they don't want Indians that look like us. No, it's very simple. They want Indians that actually look like them. So they
Okay, are there any?
yes, all across the Northeast. So there are a lot of skilled imports of people, whether in different professions, has been going from the Northeast to Japan. But no, so what I'm saying is that's another unique sort of an example. But is there a difference between how you treat or the assimilation journey of a Ukrainian refugee as opposed to a Syrian refugee in Europe?
Can I?
Yes.
And I'm sure others will. I mean, okay. The answer is yes, but the more interesting question is why.
Yes.
Right? Because there are two possible answers. One that I would, I guess, politically, culturally, from a value perspective, really have a big issue with. And that is, there is something intrinsic, right, to a Syrian or an Afghani or an Iraqi or whatever that makes him or her incapable of assimilating. And that is why the white Christian Ukrainians have assimilated better than the brown Muslim Syrians. So that I would really have an issue with. There is a second part of the answer, which is, well, the Ukrainians were offered a legal pathway, right? I mean, when it comes to asylum, actually, it was the first and only time that the so-called temporary protection directive of the European Union that allows asylum seekers to be hosted and to allowed to live and work across the European Union was the first and only time that it was activated, right? So, empirically, I would tend to think that that is the reason why there's been a much higher integration, but that's my politics that gets in the way. But I think empirically there is no way of, in a sense, proving, right? Because we could only prove the question if you had your same group.
That's right. That's
right? That, one which has one treatment and the other that has the other, but we don't have that.
That's true. Stefan, would you have?
Yes, I usually agree with Natalie when we talk about foreign policy issues, not that often when we talk about domestic politics, because I think there is, you're right, economic crisis play a role, but I think the more complicated issue is that identity play a role. And when you look at the parts of Germany where the votes for anti-migrant parties were particularly high, there's also, you rarely find migrants there. That's very low, the share of them. But these are quite homogeneous societies there. And they're doing economically quite well. Compared to where they were 20 or 25 years ago, and also I think they're almost reaching their average level in Germany. There it's more about identity, and I think also in two ways of identity. Those homogeneous societies have difficulties to accept there are people who are looking different, who are behaving different, who have a different culture, but also I think for the other sides, some of them have also difficulties to integrate and to accept this is a different culture we have to integrate and to deal with. And I think it's, unfortunately, because it's even more difficult than economy, it's very much about identity. And I think the challenge for societies like ours is that on the one hand, we need migration. We have a lack of skilled workers in Germany to maintain our social security system. I worked some years for the Federation of German Industries. We calculated that we needed about 400,000 additional migrants in Germany to maintain our level of skilled workers. But this means that also somehow the society has to adapt to a changing society, and there's hardly an alternative to it. But to balance that's the real dilemma and the real challenge we have. And unfortunately, I also don't have these answers on that. I think it has to be a mix of instruments of policies to get there. But it's a quite complicated issue to solve.
Yeah, so I can totally agree with you, Mr. Meyer. But I do think it's also okay to have an issue or to differentiate between culture and also religion when a refugee comes. Not that I am completely against someone who has a different religion, but I do have something against a Muslim who probably is anti-Semitic in his beliefs, and we do have that on our streets in Germany. But if he is just friendly and if he just does his religion the way he wants to in a friendly way and leaves other people and their religion alone, I'm fine with that. But I do think there are very different behaviors between those religions. And of course, someone who's from Ukraine who might have a similar view because they also are more drawn to the European Union in general. They are Europeans. Of course, they're closer to us in our culture, and it's easier for them to integrate anyways. But I can also tell that even though Germany, and I'm very glad we do, are standing 100% behind Ukraine, there's also people who are not happy with how Ukrainian refugees behave. If some of them are not working because our government, for example, has very high social aids for almost every migrant, and of course that's being used by migrants because we let them do it, and it's also our problem as Germany and as our government, from our government. But of course people use that, and Ukrainians use it just the way as Syrians and Afghans do it, and I think people criticize that for every migrant. And also, you mentioned, Natalie, the emotion of, or like that the debate is emotional. Of course, it's emotional when there's a feeling of insecurity. And I think it's also okay to have that feeling and to debate on that feeling. And if our people don't feel secure anymore, there needs to be a change. Even if there are reasons why people can still feel secure if they don't do it because of certain things. And if also because of, for example, there's terror attacks every couple of weeks, and the chance of being in one is low, of course, but there's still the chance of it. And I think that just scares people. It scares people that there's mass rapes of women, and I'm a young woman. I'm 27 years old, and like when I was 15, I wasn't as scared to go home at night as I am now. And it's a feeling, yes, but it's reality in our country nowadays. And I think that I hope soon government is going to change with like secure borders, with a return policy, is what we need as a country now. And I think a lot of European countries need that. And because we are talking about illegal migration here, and I also feel like it's always really, really sensitive when people mix up legal migration that we need, as Mr. Meyer also outlined, and illegal migration, which is a totally, completely different topic. And therefore, I think what we need to do is bring back people who came illegally, whose asylum was not accepted, who were denied, who do not have a right to stay in our country. And that is in our in our laws as well. If people come over the border and they don't have real passports, if they don't have a reason to stay, if they're not coming for tourism, and if they don't have a letter where they're allowed to work, they need to leave leave again. And that's a normal thing to do for every country in this world. As a German, I am lucky that with my passport I can enter a lot of countries, but if a country denies me access, I will leave and I will go back home. And I think other people in other countries and other people who try to stay there, they can try it in a legal way, they can apply for jobs, and we're happy to take them. But this way, how it's happening, is not the way to do it.
Well, thank you. Nathan, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, so America's lucky in this respect. Our immigration history and contemporary practice it almost looks providential. On the one hand, the migrants who typically come to America are fairly easily integrated. They tend to be Hispanics from our own hemisphere. They're Catholic. They want to work hard. They love their families. These are values that every American appreciates and sees in these arriving communities a mirror image of their own priorities. So we're lucky in that respect. We're also lucky in that for centuries from the beginning, we have had an ethos of integration, assimilation, call it what you will. There's subtle differences between these different approaches, but I think not worth delving into at 11 o'clock at night. Suffice it to say that American culture has held up as the ideal, the hardworking migrant who comes to America in search of a better life for himself, for her family, and wants to be as American as everybody else. Ronald Reagan used to say, America's unique because anybody can come here and become an American. You can't go to England and become an Englishman. You can't go to Japan and become a Japanese. America's different. The thing that really worries me now, however, is that while this sense of integration is still widespread among ordinary Americans, the ideal has really been discredited at the level of American elites. American elites don't believe in anything special about America. Immigrants do. Like, they're coming here for a reason. They're choosing it over where they're coming from because they know in a way that our elites don't get that there's something special and unique and precious, and they want it for themselves and they want it for their families. I'd like to trade a couple dozen Columbia professors for a couple more Nigerian immigrants, or pick your poison. I mean, go down the map. So I could say a lot more about this, but I guess what I would say is integration works when there is an expectation, a cultural expectation that it will happen, and cultural resources that promote it and make it easy. It's harder to sustain that framework when your cultural and economic and intellectual elites have sort of lost the true religion.
Well, I'm going to open it up to the audience, but before that, Sushant, one point about in our region, a country like Bangladesh took in about 1 million refugees, Rohingya refugees from Myanmar. People who follow the same religion, are probably ethnically the same, yet they were not assimilated, not integrated, in fact ghettoized, put away in camps, in places where one of those cyclones in the Bay of Bengal could actually consume them. Similarly, in Pakistan, the Afghan refugees, same ethnicity, same religion, yet not assimilated. What do you ascribe that to?
Yeah, and going by the same standard, in India, we've had problems with many of the Bangladeshi refugees who came in post 1971. And one of the problems we have had has been, although they've, in a manner of speaking, been assimilated, because we can't identify them, what has happened is that there has been a massive demographic transition in many of the states of the Indian Union, which were relatively sparsely populated, or in some of the border districts. And that's created its own problems. for the Indian state. In the case of Pakistan, again, the Pakistanis were responsible for the refugees coming into their country in the first place. They destabilized Afghanistan to a point where people had nowhere to go. The same people went to Iran also. Many of the Afghans who went to Iran have been kept in camps under very tight control. In Pakistan, again, many of them were kept in camps. They've been identified and now are being forcibly repatriated back to Afghanistan. Not for any other reason, not because they are involved in crimes in Pakistan, but simply because the Pakistanis want to get back at the current regime in Afghanistan, which Pakistan helped come into power by defying the Europeans and the Americans and the NATO troops for 20 years. They led you guys up the garden path, and they finally got a government of their choice, which has in a sense gone against them. So now they're taking the revenge on the Afghan refugees who they created in the first place. And in the case of Bangladesh, many of the Rohingyas are supposed to be Bangladeshi nationals to start with. Ideally, Bangladesh should have assimilated them in their country, but they've been kept in very, very shabby conditions in refugee camps, not been allowed to move out. And yet, these are the very same countries which will raise hell and high storm simply because their illegal migrants are being repatriated back to their countries. And so, yes, there are those double standards. But I think one thing which I must say about the Western countries, and why I say that, as long as you allowed legal migration, as long as it was a controlled kind of a migration and you allowed people to come in because you had a requirement and they were able to, in a sense, assimilate within the society, you didn't have the problems. It's when you just simply opened the floodgates that you started getting the problems because you could not manage the flows. You did not know what kind of people you were letting in. There was no control mechanism out there. So in a manner of speaking, a lot of the stuff which is happening now, you called it upon yourself. Secondly, and that is one of the good things which has happened in the West, there is racism everywhere, some amount of it. One can make a big issue out of it or it can be ignored. But I think one good thing about the Western countries was that people who even migrated legally were allowed a lot of freedom, were allowed religious freedoms. They were allowed to keep their identity intact. They were not forced into, eliminating their own identity, and because they could not become, for example, Germans. They could never really become Germans the way original Germans were, but they could be good German citizens. So they managed to do that. You allowed them religious freedoms. You did all of that. Now, if those freedoms are going to be misused, then you have a serious problem on your hand. And that is what should have been the responsibility of these states, to ensure that those freedoms which are given to people are not weaponized against the state which has given them refuge. Unfortunately, you guys failed to do that. So what is happening is not surprising.
Questions and comments from the floor? Keep them short. We've got 10 minutes. So just...
I'll make it very quick. So I'm from Sri Lanka, and we went through a very big war. And during the war, a lot of Tamilians went out of the country, and they made a massive diaspora out of the country, especially countries like Europe, Canada, UK. And the long-term effects of this has been after many years in that country, they assume positions of power and use the power of the government of that country to exert pressure on countries like Sri Lanka. Now, you see, when the war finished, most of the riots you saw in Canada, you saw in England, and so, like Mrs. Sareen said, how can governments act to ensure this doesn't happen? Because at the end of the day, like, is that diaspora actually representing the interest of your country?
So migration due to economic reasons, ethnic reasons, or due to climate change is a given. It is coming. So we are discussing whether migration is good or bad, if we handle it right or wrong, whether it's the problem of the host or the migrant. But it's a given, it will happen by 2050. We will be forced to accept the migrants, whether it is South Asia, Pacific Island countries, Northern Africa, or Europe, or even in the United States. What are the policy measures we can adopt as a nation state, and what are the factors, social, economic, political, we should bring in so that the host and the migrants are together?
Okay, just one thing. If you could just say whether it's a comment or a question, and if you want to address it to a specific person, do so. I saw then her and then you.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Bastian. I'm from Germany, and I'm a member of the Federal Executive Board of CDU, which is our incoming ruling party. And I would like to make a comment because I would like to fully underscore what Ambassador Hales and Mr. Serene said. I think migration per se is neither positive or negative. It depends on what kind of migration. If you have someone coming who wants to become a nurse, who wants to become a doctor, to become a good member of society, nobody has a problem with that. But I think a society has a right to choose. And a society has a right to determine whether they want me in or not. If I apply for a visa to India, the Indian government has every right to assess whether I will be beneficial, whether my stay will be beneficial or not. And if they don't want me, I have to respect that. And I think what we've seen in Europe and as well in the United States over the last decades did not follow that rule. And the population does no longer accept it. And I think if we do not regulate it in a sensible way early, things like what's now happening in America can happen, because if the population has the feeling that political elites ignore the problems, they will tend to turn further and further to the radicals, and that's maybe not always benefiting a sensible solution either. And so I think the problem is that the political left globally tried to delegitimize this right of society to choose, to make a decision, because they say it's somehow a human right to live wherever you want. No, it's not. I have no right to go into your home. I have no right to live in your country. You have the right to make the decision. If you think I will benefit your society, you probably will allow me in, but you have the right to choose so. And I think we have to re-establish that rule in general. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Go right ahead.
Thank you very much. I would like to make a comment and correct something that my fellow Germans have said, because I feel the urge to do so. You said that foreigners have a high criminality according to the statistics, and it's true. The statistics show that foreigners commit crimes, but the image is distorted, and for several reasons. First, because some crimes only foreigners can commit because of their special statutes, such as statements about their false statements about their entry. Also, secondly, there's no distinction in the statistics between. Please let her complete. Between those who live in Germany and who are well integrated, and those who just pass through and commit crimes. And then also, people in Germany are more likely to report people who look like immigrants because they are biased. And then fourth, if you take a more differentiated statistic and you look at the social statutes, you see that immigrants with the same social status as Germans are less likely to commit crimes. And now I would like to pass the floor to my colleague from Africa, because we need to hear an African voice on immigration.
Yeah, so my first question is definitely on climate-induced migration, and how do you perceive it in the... Yeah, how do you perceive climate-induced migration? But also the second question is, in the universities, how do you ensure that there's an expression of freedom and critical questioning to the encampment one?
Okay, do you want to just address the stuff that is out there now? Should we just take a couple more?
Yeah, whenever statistics are brought up, it's very interesting how you read them. And if I look at blank statistics, I see that in percentage, migrants or refugees have a higher percentage of committing crimes than Germans do. And especially when it comes to really hard crimes, when it comes to crimes like stabbing people, when it comes to crimes like rape, when it comes to theft, or like I don't know the correct word, but like strong theft or whatever, there is a tendency where that happens a lot more. Of course, there's a lot of people who do not commit crimes. There's a lot of people who have who have integrated super well. But the problem is that if masses migrate, the need for integration is a lot lower because they can just live in their segregated neighborhoods, and it has happened a lot in the US already where there's segregated neighborhoods, and it's an actual political term there, and we see that in Germany too. And if that happens, there's also no space for society to integrate them really well, which is also a task for us as well. Of course, I feel like whenever it comes to migration and integration, there's always two sides, and there's always two people, or those two sides that carry a responsibility. And I don't want to take that away from the Germans as well, but there is facts that there's more crimes, and whoever commits crimes is not welcome in my point of view, and whoever is not committing crimes and is legally there or has an approved asylum is allowed to be there and is allowed to work, hopefully, and to integrate and to have a future in Germany. But as soon as his asylum is over, there needs to be a debate if that person can stay or if they also have to go home, in my opinion.
Thank you. Good evening. My question is to Shanton, and please pardon my little meandering before that. I think Europe and America thinks the issue of migration is pretty new. Just a bit of history, and I'll bring it home. Ghana started expelling Nigerians in about 1969, and Nigeria also reversed and expelled about 1 million Ghanaians back to Ghana in 1983. It's not brand new. And every single time there was a nationalistic agenda behind it, hidden over the disguise of economic turmoil. So I think there's a very serious reasons why these things happen, and the sooner we embrace that there's a political reason behind all of this, the better. Now, to my question, because I think any other response would just be met by more rebuttals. How can countries in the global south make it easy to ensure that returnees are able to come back home with dignity and pride, and reduces the amount of inhumane treatments they face over there at the border before they make it back home? I think this is something that we need to also talk about, the journey back home.
Thank you. I'm going to, since time's up, I'm going to go for quick closing remarks, and we will go the other way. So Nathan, you go first.
Can I pass?
Yes, of course.
Look, no, I think I wouldn't say that migration is a net neutral. It is on balance beneficial, at least for a country like the United States that has the history that the United States has of welcoming people who are prepared to, whatever their religious background, whatever their ethnic background, whatever their national origin, whatever their social class, are prepared to coalesce around certain shared principles that are not terribly demanding, and that do not exclude really any political view or any religious view from the public square. Do you believe in equality of opportunity? Great, here's your visa. Do you believe in freedom of speech? Welcome to Ellis Island. Do you think that you should take over a university building because of conflicts in the Middle East? Do you think that university janitors should be held hostage and then beaten with chairs? Perhaps you would prefer to study elsewhere. Ultimately, the question of immigration is a question of national interest. I want to echo something that our German friend said. It is not a question of justice. It is, but it's first and initially a question of what is in the national interest. And sometimes it is in the national interest to pursue a migration-related policy that pursues social justice. America has a special obligation to Afghan translators who risked their lives to stand with coalition forces during our 20-year adventure in Afghanistan. Justice absolutely enters into this, but that is a question for the nation to decide, not for the UN, not for NGOs. So with that framework in mind, I think migration has been incredibly beneficial to the United States. And I think it can be incredibly beneficial to other countries that follow a similar model.
Thank you. Can I just go? Yeah. Stefan, can you?
I think, yes, migration is necessary and to a certain degree unavoidable. But we have to accept that societies might be overwhelmed by migration. And so we have to deal with that and we have to manage migration. And I think what we have done or tried in Europe so far not really implemented, but the Compact of Migration and Asylum gives some hints how we can deal with that by securing borders, by having fast and efficient procedures dealing with asylum seekers, by also an effective system of solidarity and responsibility between the European countries, but also by migration partnership agreements with other countries. I think we need a mixture of instruments to apply, and that's the way forward.
Yeah, very briefly. I mean, I'll just say that I think the aspect of this conversation, which to me at least has been a little bit troubling, is that I feel that we have been mixing apples and oranges quite a bit. We've been talking about migration, and of course, when it comes to migration, of course, you choose the national interest and this and that and the other, and legal migration, irregular migration, whatever. But we've been mixing this up with asylum. And surely when it comes to asylum and therefore protection, then it's not a question of what are your skills or what's your religion or what's your color and the right to choose. It's a question of protection. Either we have the honesty of saying, you know what, we just get rid of all of that. Fine, well, not fine, yeah, but let's be honest about it. Or, we better go back to making that distinction, because when it comes to Europe, actually most of the people that we're talking about, it's not a coincidence that we're talking about Syrians and Ukrainians and Afghanis. Well, hey, they've come from countries at war, right? So we're talking about asylum seekers. We're not talking about migration.
That's a very good distinction. Sushant and Caroline.
Okay, so 3 very quick points. One, on asylum. I don't think all asylum seekers are genuine. And in many cases, we've seen a lot of fakery in the kind of asylum seekers who come in many of these countries. And they use the laws of these countries to pretend that they are gay or pretend that they are religious minority, they are being persecuted when they are not. So that is one. Second, there is a certain cultural context of countries from where migrants come from. Now, in the Indian subcontinent, we've seen the case of people of the Indian diaspora cutting across religion, cutting across what regions they come from, who go into places, are law-abiding, work hard, take care of their families, try and fit into the societies, maintain their cultural identity, and yet prosper and don't cause trouble. And we see people from within the same region who go into countries and cause law and order problems, want to impose their own faith, their own religion, their own culture on the countries in which they're living. So clearly, I think some kind of a distinction needs to be made. And finally, I think these questions have been asked by some of these young people out here. Look, I agree, migration has happened since the beginning of human history. Okay, it's not going to end simply because somebody wants to end it. And what has also happened is that migration historically has happened for economical reasons. People from poor militaristic societies tend to go to prosperous societies, which have also been softened by their prosperity. We might be seeing a similar phenomena unfold right now.
So first of all, of course, nobody leaves their country and their home, their parents, their family behind with no reason. And of course, there's countries where there's war, where there's a need for asylum, which is a form of migration, in my opinion. But then they have the right to go to the next safest country, which ultimately, if I look at the map, would probably not be Germany, just or Austria or something. But of course, and I think that is something that maybe adds something new, because I've set my opinion, but of course the West carries a responsibility to make life easier and to make life livable in countries where people seem to have the impression or where people seem to not find a future right now. And that is something that we also need to change, because we can't just talk about how we do not want people to come to our countries, but also how we can make their lives better. And I think that's something where I hope everybody can agree on, and where we also have to see that we make the world a better place in order for people to want to stay where their home is and where everybody can kind of live together. If we travel, if we come to conferences like this where we talk about things, and then I think we can all be happy.
Yes.
One sentence. Just one sentence, because there are a lot of Europeans sitting out here, and I must say this. Look, if you don't want migration coming into your countries, don't impose your values on other countries militarily. Don't try and destabilize them, because once you destabilize those countries, there will be migration to your countries.